So while the stage is being set, let me say a few words about the next part of our conference. It's the last and I think very much anticipated part of this conference, what we call a policy discussion. So here we invited prominent experts from the United States and South Korea to share with us and with each other their thoughts on the current state of relationship between the two Koreas and China, and also to think about the meaning of that relationship for the United States' role in Asia. Let me introduce the participants of this panel. First, Dr. Jaewoo Choo is currently a professor of Chinese foreign policy in the Department of Chinese Studies at Kyung University. Yeah. Just last year, Dr. Choo published 2 books on the history and current state of relationship between the United States, China, and Korea, North Korea particularly. Ambassador Mark Minton currently serves as a professor of practice in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global International Studies here. Ambassador Minton is the former president of the Korea Society in New York, former US ambassador to Mongolia, and a diplomat for more than 30 years. Oh, wow, I don't see him. Yeah, okay. Dr. John Park is an Asia security analyst at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he serves as director of Korea projects and an adjunct lecturer in public policy. Dr. Jung Park is a senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation chair in Korean Studies at Brookings Institution Center for East Asia Policy Studies. Okay, here is Ambassador Mark Minton. And this discussion is going to be moderated by Feinstein, who is our dean. He's the founding dean and professor of international studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global International Studies. Prior to joining Indiana University, he served as U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Poland and as a senior fellow and deputy director of studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. You can read more detailed introductions to our participants here on the last page of the program of this conference. And please join me one more time in welcoming our participants.
Thank you very much. Can colleagues hear me? Terrific. Well, I'm glad we had a little bit of a break because we were just discussing what a tough act to follow. Professor Kim, thank you so much for that beautiful idea to integrate music into the program today. Welcome to the policy part of the third annual conference sponsored by the Institute for Korean Studies, and congratulations again to its founding director, Professor Sung-Kyung Kim of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and welcome to the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. We're still getting used to the new name, but we couldn't be more proud to be named after 2 of the most respected foreign policy voices in this country. And of course, one of those gentlemen in particular, Senator Lugar, pioneered work really central to part of our discussion today, which was the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which he designed and implemented in conjunction with then Senator Sam Nunn. And just earlier this week, Senator Lugar mentioned to me that prior to the Singapore summit in June, he and Senator Nunn were asked to come to the White House, where they briefed the president and vice president about the possible applications of the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program to the North Korea circumstance. So That's a way of saying that this is a timely conversation. We're doing it in the Hamilton Lugar School way, which is bringing together policy perspectives, but also embedded in the context of the society, culture, and politics of the place. And we have, as you already heard from the introductions, and as you can see in your programs, people who are steeped both in the policy as well as in the context of the societies in which this policy is set. So we'll conduct this panel on the record, and we will do it in conversation style with my colleagues, the five of us. We'll begin with a set of questions. We'll talk amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up to all of you. I'll start to my left with Professor Choo. South Korean President Moon has been the chief choreographer of this latest burst of diplomatic activity, preceding but maybe beginning in earnest with the Peace Olympics.
Yes.
In last February in Pyeongchang. Can you give us your sense of what President Moon's diplomatic goals are with North Korea, of course, but also more broadly for the region, and given the subject matter of our discussion as well for relations with China?
Yes, thank you. I think his primary goals in the context of inter-Korean relations and South Korea's relation with China could be summarized in two perspectives, probably. And one is to really engage more with North Korea on the economic front, and in order to really facilitate it and realize it, I think he's also seeking a deeper economic cooperation with China, and that is to connect his so-called new Northern economic policy to China's OBOR, One Belt, One Road initiatives. And by doing that, he sees that OBOR connection could be utilized as, North Korea's economic outlet to the outside world. And I think toward that end, I think that's where it has been moving towards too. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And maybe just turning to Ambassador Minton to pick up on that. So, the way that this burst of diplomatic activity developed might not have been something that many people in this audience and many people in Washington, D.C. would have predicted or liked. There isn't much of a policy planning process in Washington, D.C., sort of beginning with threats and then ending with hugs and then having unscripted meetings is not the usual way of doing things, but nonetheless, there are discussions which are substantive and in an area that has bedeviled at least for U.S. Presidential administrations. From your perspective, having been involved in those negotiations over the course of years, and also as the former president of the Korea Society, can you give us a sense of what you feel this sort of burst of diplomatic activity, however unorthodox, has been and is on regional politics?
Well, thank you, Dean. You're quite right. I mean, it's sort of upended traditional patterns of engagement with North Korea. Maybe we're actually going to start out with hugs and end up with threats. I don't know, but that's an unusual turnaround. In more specific ways, this diplomacy that really started with the Winter Olympics and the invitation of North Korea to participate and quickly became engagement north-south and then engagement at the highest levels with the United States and North Korea does upend the process we saw in the agreed framework during the Clinton years, the six-party talks with North Korea during the George W. Bush administration, and even the four-party talks of the Clinton administration, which was to actually work on a peace treaty. The usual way is that you work up a very precise agenda, and working level groups raise the agenda and try to make progress on the agenda. They usually do this in secret, before any results are announced. You make some progress, and then finally, if you're very lucky, you bring in very high-level officials, even possibly the president. The only time we've gotten close to that previously was when President Clinton briefly, at the end of his term, considered a trip to Pyongyang, but decided he didn't have enough time to do it. But you'll recall that Madeleine Albright did go, but that was only after years and years of diplomatic preparation. Usually you address the major issues head on, and that's what the negotiation is about. This time around, it's very, very different. There's no set agenda. We started at the top, basically, with the two presidents, North and South, and then President Trump joining. Seemingly the results, most of the results to date are in public and have to do with changing public attitudes and public relations. And it seems that many of the major issues, such as solving the nuclear problem or the missile problem, have been deferred. Even something that's gotten recent publicity, human rights, is maybe more than deferred. It's almost invisible now. And I think there are two or three main stylistic features of this recent diplomacy that make it quite different and probably will create long-term implications for the parties involved, North and South Korea and the United States and China as well. The first, one of the, I've alluded to it, salient features of this diplomacy is it's leadership-led. Now, when you make the leader, the president of your country, the first one that goes in trying to resolve problems, you almost guarantee that you cannot fail. Well, you might fail, but you can't say you failed because presidents don't like to fail. So that means you have to keep the process going at all costs. It also means that the focus becomes on symmetry. It sort of erodes the effectiveness of contacts at a lesser level. The parties hold out till they can get to the top official because they know they can turn it all around if they can just convince Kim Jong-un or Moon Jae-in or Donald Trump, that this is the way the issue should be resolved. So that leads to the necessity of frequent summits. And of course, we're seeing that. The pace of the summits is picking up. There have been 3 North-South. There will be 2. This is within 1 year, U.S. North Korea. And it makes the presidents the action officers. And since presidents can never be as well briefed or as into the weeds as experts that would usually be working at a lower level, the conclusions and the handling of the substantive issues is going to be at a very high level of generality, and there will be an emphasis put on personal contacts. Trust, establishing trust over substance. We're seeing all those things happen. The second salient point is that this process has been led by the Koreans. This is quite unusual. The two Koreas, certainly not the two Koreas, but South Korea, no Korean nation, has ever led the process of engagement with North Korea on, say, the nuclear issue. The United States has always done that, or the outside powers have always done that in the case of the 6-party talks. But this time, the Koreans are in the lead. And this makes a big difference because the practical effect is while denuclearization, the missile programs, or even human rights are still there and important and mentioned, certainly, and are part of the objectives of the engagement, they've somewhat been downgraded. The most important thing to North Korea and South Korea is to relax tensions on their peninsula. And as the professor said, perhaps economic engagement for mutual benefit of North and South Korea. So this is the emphasis now, and this is to be the primary objective of international engagement with North Korea. This in the forefront is quite new. which sounds really bad if you're someone that's really interested in non-proliferation, because the emphasis has been a bit taken off of that. But on the other hand, if you stand back, it may not be such a bad thing, because the nuclear problem is inextricably intertwined with tensions on the Korean Peninsula going back to the Korean War. It's like the chicken and the egg. You can't really get to denuclearization unless there's a relaxation of tension and some trust and engagement of all the parties, including North Korea. And you can't get that unless you are also simultaneously solving the nuclear problem. That's why in the Clinton administration there were two negotiating paths established. One, the agreed framework for the nuclear problem, and the four-party talks to make what is talked about a lot these days, a peace treaty for the Korean Peninsula. That was the objective of the four-party talks. So you can see these things, even way back in the 90s, were seen in tandem. They have to go together. And so this is perhaps what's happening now. There have always been two choices about how to approach North Korea or the nuclear problem. Through the front door, dealing with the problem directly on. That's what we tried in the agreed framework, the six-party talks, and the results haven't been great. Or the back door, in which you try to work on a lot of things at the periphery and ease tensions and then get to the harder issues later. These are early days yet, but it seems that we're going in this new and perhaps promising direction.
So what Professor Minton, Ambassador Minton, has just pointed to is one of these irresolvable debates, which is can you deal with difficult adversaries with whom you have very limited relations by starting with nuclear issues and on the arms control track? Or is that not possible? And I think you could probably argue that in both directions looking historically, and I bet we'll have a chance to do that. And I wanted now to go to Dr. Park, who's just back from meetings in Beijing, 1.5 track, 1.5, not track 2 exactly, but talks with experts from inside and outside government and scholars as well, which focused largely on these issues. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how things look from Beijing. Beijing's obviously isn't physically present in the room. What wasn't in Singapore and won't be if there is, in fact, another summit coming up. But they're obviously playing a major role, and not only behind the scenes. So if you can give us a sense of how things look from Beijing, and please feel free to add onto that.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and Professor Kim, thank you for hosting this. The opportunity to engage on these different topics really give a sense of how quickly things are moving. But in terms of the meetings in Beijing, we expected to go in talking about the denuclearization efforts, the summits, and the first question we got was Vice President Pence's speech about this whole idea of how the US is approaching China, and the idea and the realization that in terms of all of these events happening, the broader context for the Chinese side is the strategic implications of a US-China trade war. And so as you see that lens being the dominant one, we started to hear more about Chinese concerns and preferences in the region, but you see the de-emphasis on the priority of denuclearization, the sense that the Moon government is moving forward with a game plan, that denuclearization is now in the midst of a mechanism and a process, and the summitry is moving forward in terms of a lot of areas that have been held back. One of the key things, though, as there is in the United States, as there is in South Korea, there is in China as well, different interest groups and different analysts and the different perspectives. And when you hear them, what's striking is this ongoing puzzle. The same event would happen, and the optimists would become more optimistic, and the pessimists would become more pessimistic. So how do you square that puzzle? And one thing that you find is when it comes to the analysis and the way these different groups approach this on the Chinese analytical community side, you essentially see the difference between those groups, the Chinese technical community. These are individuals who look at nuclear proliferation. In many cases, they're trained as nuclear physicists, so they understand the different pathways to nuclear weapons, what it will take to dismantle, the timelines, and so forth. Then you have those who are more of the political process analysts. For the first group, the technical community, they're very skeptical of these statements that are coming out of these summits. And they're very concerned that we're going to default to a situation where North Korea receives concessions and then basically the process ends. We go through a period of quiet, escalation of tensions, and a reversion back to what we've become very familiar with. The folks who are looking at it from the political prospect side see something very, very different. This idea that they are not even privy, even in the rumor mill, of what's happening in the summit level. And so while we do see the summitry happen and there's scant details, these declarations are bullet points and not much follow-up. The understandings in the political process side, I think, is an area that the Chinese analytical community that do look at the policy side and what's happening between the respective executive leader positions are very concerned about. The 2 points I want to highlight before wrapping up here is this idea from the Chinese side that what they advocated last year, what was called the dual freeze. North Korea would freeze its nuclear and ballistic missile testing. US and South Koreans would freeze their military exercises as a way to de-escalate. Last year, that was completely ignored. But in many respects, what we heard about the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics earlier this year, the Moon government in South Korea used that as an opportunity to, in effect, implement the dual freeze. And that's what we're seeing as this bedrock, this foundation for these other movements. The other element that I think is crucial from a Chinese perspective is the sense that they always encourage the US and North Korea to talk it out. Peaceful approach to resolving these differences through dialogue. That's the old standard talking point all the way to the early 1990s. But once the United States and North Korea get into these discussions, China feels very paranoid. This idea agreements can happen at the expense of Chinese national interests. And because it's elevated at the leader level, I think that concern, that paranoia is particularly acute. But this is all where the technical and the political community in China, as we are here as well, we have to wait and see. I think this is something that overall is viewed as taking a lot of political risk. And in terms of how this all turns out, overlaying that with the US-China trade war and also the sense of urgency. The leaders are moving exceptionally fast. If you thought the past few months with these summits were fast, the idea of what's in store is going to be even more in terms of this accelerated fashion, because they're talking in terms of weeks and months, and this idea that it is something that has to be more or less concluded in terms of the political agreements and the implementation. And this is really a discussion, we'll talk a little bit more, and on this point, about a declaration. And this is a declaration to announce the formal end of the Korean War. And there are a lot of different moving pieces that, and we'll unravel pieces of it, but that's different from a peace treaty. And so the movement towards a political document, there's a great deal of focus in having that as a centerpiece for the second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un.
That's very helpful. I wonder, just as a follow-up, so the Chinese are focused on the trade war and the tariffs. Do they perceive this as an integrated strategy by the United States, or do they recognize it as for what it is, which is just two policies which are not intended to affect one another?
I think for those who are closer to the government think tank community advising the senior Chinese leadership, they see this as a very complex situation of unintended consequences of different streams happening simultaneously. But just as they saw the breakthrough on the nuclear issue and the tensions of last year by going directly to the leader level, there is a Chinese priority now to go directly to President Trump to broker some sort of truce on the trade war. And in an upcoming international gathering, there is the inclination to use that on the sidelines for President Xi to meet with President Trump. But the broader aspect of this, I think it ties into Chinese concern that the old way of interacting with the US government and the US administration don't work. On the trade issue, there are 5 different chefs in the kitchen. And so as they try to calibrate who represents truly the White House and the president's view, these 5 individuals, from Commerce Secretary to Treasury Secretary to US Trade Representative and others, they're all saying different things. And I think it adds to this concern that this is of vital interest for China, but they're not seeing a coordinated, consistent type of message coming from Washington.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Pak, you sort of bridge those two worlds of technical experts and people who focus on the political process. So from your experience as an analyst inside the US government and now on Massachusetts Avenue at the Brookings Institution in Washington, how do you see the talks proceeding and how would you evaluate them so far? And maybe as an analyst, what factors should we be looking for in the future to evaluate how it's going?
Yeah, first, thank you for this wonderful conference. I can't believe it's the 3rd annual. And thanks to all of you for being here on a late Friday afternoon. That's amazing. I don't think I would have done that when I was in college. But when I look at, I would say that I'm one of the bigger skeptics in Washington on what's going on. I think when Ambassador Minton talks about the policy process, it should resonate. It resonates with me because I've been in those meetings, at least representing the CIA on these types of issues. And what the process does is that even though as excruciating as they can be, with meeting after meeting, dealing with minutia after minutia, is that you have a whole of government effort on a particular threat. And if North Korea is the #1 national security threat, which the Trump administration has called it, then we can't rely on President Trump freelancing on this issue. And I think in this university setting, we can't afford to grade the president on a curve on these types of issues. In many ways, I think there are lots of things that, I get why a leader-to-leader meeting works. The foreign ministry of the North Koreans, they just they have their usual talking points. They don't say very much. And Kim Jong-un has been clear from the very beginning that he controls the nuclear button because it's on his desk, if you remember. So it makes sense for there to be a leader-to-leader meeting to talk about these vital issues and move the needle. But let's look at how the Singapore summit happened. It happened spur of the moment where President Trump decided to have this press conference after the South Korean envoys briefed him on their trip. So he says, yes, we're going to have this meeting. Let's have this summit, press conference. So what that does is that it loosens the leverage, the maximum leverage that a presidential summit could have had with Kim Jong-un. The North Koreans have wanted a presidential summit for a long time, so this was an easy carrot to dangle, but gave it away. Secondly, there's a way to maintain ambiguity about what you're going to do about a summit. So after that press conference, you could have said, well, let's see what happens and let's see what the negotiators can do. But in effect, what happened was that the negotiators were told that June 12th was the date of the summit. So when you're a negotiator and trying to think about, negotiate and finagle some acceptable language from the North Koreans, when you have a deadline and the North Koreans know this, then there's very little incentive for Pyongyang to give on any of those. And I think that's one of the primary reasons that we have such a watered down statement from Singapore. Third, I think, I keep asking myself why. Why did Kim do all of those things in the second half of 2017? Why? And I think it's not just to complete the nuclear weapons program that he said he was going to complete, but I think it's because he also saw an opportunity with the US president who's consistently bashed alliances over the head. He had a not so great first summit with President Moon back in June when he clobbered him with burden sharing and on the chorus FTA. And he saw a progressive government in South Korea that offered opportunities for him, whereas in the previous 10 years, you had a very hardline South Korean government that the US had to wheel to rein in for their hardline. And so I think that Kim might have seen an opportunity there where the stars aligned that he can take advantage to try to erode the US-South Korea alliance and to advance his capabilities. At the end of the day, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, has the threat been reduced? Whether we're talking about military strikes or we're talking about engagement, I think we have to ask ourselves, has the threat been reduced? And from my perspective, it hasn't. Reports continue to leak out that North Koreans are developing their solid fuel ballistic missiles. They're refurbishing their enrichment facilities. And so far, we've seen very few, so far we've seen superficial cosmetic changes to their nuclear weapons program. And I fear that the era of symmetry, the pageantry, really hides the rot within, and that we're not really seriously dealing with those types of issues. Now, some of the signposts that I would say, the US president and I think President Moon as well have been telling the public that we have to have faith. Kim is sincere. How many times have we heard Kim is honorable? He means it this time. He's not like his dad. So it's kind of like this is when I feel like I'm the friend of a friend of someone who has a really bad boyfriend, where, baby, I'm not like my dad. I'll never do it again. I've really changed. But look at the signposts on. Let's look at some of the signposts to keep ourselves honest and to keep Kim honest. So one of the things I would see is a loosening of restrictions on human rights. So I think Ambassador Minton rightly pointed out that we don't talk about human rights anymore. But for me, that's a sure signpost that Kim is serious about a fundamentally different relationship with the United States and the outside world. And that was number one in the Singapore statement about this different relationship with the outside world. Second is if there was some evidence that Kim has agreed to talk about denuclearization of North Korea, not denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which means the entire world. So Kim Il-sung's apparent dying wish was for the entire world to be denuclearized. That's not going to happen. But Kim Jong-un continues to use that definition as part of delaying and deflecting. So if Kim actually says something about denuclearization of North Korea, then I'll start to believe him. Third, if I see Kim considering inspections and a verification measures on some fissile materials or fissile facilities, don't tell us where they are. Just give us some indication that you're considering it. So far, we haven't seen any of that, other than this vague notion of observers or some unspecified inspectors coming in to see the blown-up tunnel and so the missile engine test site. So I'll stop there and turn it over to you.
All right, why don't we just talk amongst ourselves a little bit, and then please get ready for some questions. I wisely left my phone as my clock elsewhere. So if someone can just give me a prompt, let's say when, how are we? Until about 5, we have time, we have an hour, yeah? We're great, okay. So do we have anyone on the panel who has a less pessimistic view about, without taking sides, about the prospects of this sort of diplomatic burst of activity?
Let me jump in. Not in terms of an optimistic view, but I think one of the things that is happening now, I totally agree in terms of grading on a curve aspect. We shouldn't let that be the case, but it's not just the case of the US leader. All of the leaders involved are grading themselves. And so we're having a very subjective type of situation here. And that's a part that enables them to move forward with the summits. And so it's this dynamic that I think we're uncharted territory and that gives pause to many in terms of how quickly things are going. But in the previous cycle, the lack of progress on denuclearization led to these political engagements grinding to a halt and then collapsing. But we're not seeing that right now. And if anything, there's a recognition that because of those precedents, there's a further acceleration on the summitry. And so that's the part where if you zero in on the political process here, even on things like the idea of early stage denuclearization activity, the bar is lower. And in the case of the subjectivity on, I think, President Trump's side, for him it's not the evaluation, are the North Koreans producing a declaration on the nuclear facilities and the material? It's purely on the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And as long as North Korea is not testing, he can subjectively state that he's removed the threat. Now, for the technical community, that definitely is not the case. There are reports of continued activity, and if anything, it's a pause rather than any type of irreversible step that the North Korean side has taken. So the subjectivity of how the leaders are evaluating themselves, number one, and number two is this sense of window of opportunity. So the leaders are rushing in terms of the next stages here. And so this is the element that when it comes to outside observers looking at what are the implications of all this, there are a lot of different tectonic plates moving, not just on the nuclear issue, but as we look at Japan and how they're addressing their security concerns as well. So something that starts out as a focus on denuclearization in North Korea, if you follow these different dots, it becomes to the broader point of how countries are responding to it in very different, uncoordinated ways. And from a broader analytical community, the unintended, intended consequence aspect, there's a lot of work to be done.
How does President Moon take tranquilizers? How is it that he's done a remarkable job diplomatically to work with incredibly difficult personalities? What keeps him up at night, and where does he think this is headed? What does he want for the next round, the next summit, if there is?
I think you're asking the wrong person here, because I'm not a big fan of Moon, to be frank. But anyways, yes, he's been trying to pursue his own strategy. I don't think I give it a wrong term. It's not his own strategy. I think we have to go back to his political background, because he was a protege of former President Roh Moo-hyun, and he's trying to pick up whatever Roh Moo-hyun had left, 10 years ago, and that's including common prosperity and development policy with North Korea, and all these domestic economic policies, raising taxes and so forth. So his strategy has been, I think, very subjective in a way that he has his own political belief and values that he wants to carry over from the Roh Moo-hyun administration. And just like John just said, he's very subjective, just like other leaders too here. He's very subjective in a way. He just wants to yap it away of what he wants to say, and without listening to anybody else. That's not only the situation with domestic audience, but with the foreign audience too. The way he's been boasting about his achievements with his dialogue with Mr. Trump, Kim Jong-un, and even recently, Pope Francis too. He said he delivered an invitation from Kim Jong-un, but I don't know if he understands the course of history here, because Vatican and North Korea, let alone North Korea, but Vatican and China's relationship is a great example. I mean, it speaks volume. And who's to believe Vatican is going to accept Kim Jong-un's invitation right away, and probably include it in his Asia tour next year? I don't think that's going to happen. But also Moon has been really persistent with his demand to the United States as well as to the United Nations to lift up some sanctions on North Korea. But here we got to be careful with his remarks and demands, because he's been demanding only those sanctions that could affect the inter-Korean economic engagement. He doesn't mean to lift up, cancel out all the UN resolutions or international community sanctions on North Korea as a whole. So he's been trying to focus on his own particular issues, but at the same time, does that sound persuasive to Mr. Trump and other players in this region? I think so. In the end, without having really concrete basis for his argument and persuasion to other regional players here, I think that's where he's going to run into trouble if nothing concrete comes out as a result of his endeavor.
So, are we in a worse situation as a consequence of this engagement? I recognize that it is so far not produced any measurable results in terms of denuclearization. But is there concern here that it will revert back to the status quo ante and be back at threats? And I guess we have a couple of former government people on the panel and others who watch closely. If you were in government now, what would you be advising? What would you do to
well, government officials below the level of the president are, go one step at a time. That's what we did yesterday, so that we'll do this today, and maybe we'll do this tomorrow. You probably know you were in the policy planning staff, as I was, of course, in a much more exalted position. But early in my career, I was in the policy planning staff, and there's, precious little policy planning done in government. It's more or less process, and it's very bureaucratic. But for that reason, I think there is a prejudice on the part of officials or people who have worked in government to kind of keep on doing what they've always been doing. And that includes objectives and goals and policy positions. I'm afraid we might be missing, to some extent, how greatly the world is changing. These negotiations and the way they've gone are both a result of the way the world is changing, and they're also adding to the momentum of how the world is changing. The two Koreas, at some basic level, beyond all the policy differences and the difference in interests and ideology and the bad history and the conflict, seem to understand something I think is manifestly true, that we're in a new era. This isn't the Cold War, and it isn't the post-Cold War era. U.S. influence and power is receding or making an adjustment for other major players. We no longer the major trading partner for any Asian country. China is. In the last year or so, the United States and China have changed the basic definition of their relationship ever since we normalized with China in the 70s. That is, China is no longer, when was the last time anyone used responsible stakeholder? We're competitors now with the gloves off. The United States has a president who doesn't have any direct policy or ideological moorings except what is visibly and even short-term in the advantage of the United States and maybe in his own personal advantage. Now, if you're a Korean, a middle power, north or south, you can see that as both a big problem and a big opportunity. The problem is this isn't an era for alliances. This isn't an era for treaties or set relationships. We're really in the era that Lord Palmerston called, famous definition, countries have no permanent friends or enemies. They just have permanent interests. And as far as the Koreans are concerned, I mean, this is an opportunity to sort of move forward and take control of their own affairs, which is actually one thing that officials in North Korea and South Korea have always had in common, and which I think Korean people sort of resent, that they've been washed this way and that way by the tides of history. And this moment is an opportunity to sort of seize control, at least on the Korean Peninsula, of how things develop and have the rest of the world in a supportive role rather than a role of dictating under what terms relaxation and rapprochement will come to the two Koreas. And so I think in all these ways, it's a very new moment. And, we may have to loosen our expectations with regard to some of the old guidelines about how you treat this problem or North Korea, because events may just overwhelm our long-held convictions and ideas about how matters should be arranged as far as the Korean Peninsula is concerned.
Thank you. I see some questions out there, so we'll start in the back, and just please identify yourself for everybody. And is there a floating microphone? Terrific. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, my question is simple. Yeah, South Korea is also solid, and North Korea also has its own consistency in its policy. But how do you expect President Trump's attitude after midterm?
I can't predict his attitude tomorrow or an hour from now. I thought the summit would be before the midterms because North Korea is considered by President Trump as a victory. I mean, it's already in his rallies. He's already declared it a victory that North Korea is not a threat in his tweets, and so, I think, in my mind, in the way where I go into the dark corners of my mind, where I think. The danger of this very personal relationship between Trump and Kim is, as you might have noticed, Kim says, I've had, this is after the New York Times op-ed came out about this, people working behind the scenes trying to save the world. Kim said after that op-ed came out, I have unwavering faith in you. I've never said anything bad about you, never mind the mentally deranged comment from last year. And so when Secretary of State Pompeo tried to go to Pyongyang last month, Kim decided not to meet with him and decided instead to go inspect a potato farm. So I don't see that as a sign that Kim is serious about wanting to talk about real issues. Instead of, if mom says something that you don't like, you go straight to dad. And that's exactly what happened where they said, do we have to take this up to the president? And so that's the danger of having this personal relationship and not bureaucratizing it and professionalizing it in the way that, the government is supposed to be doing. I also think that I think there might be a moment where Kim gets just fed up and just, knocks everything off the table and he says, I knew you couldn't do it because you're too old and you're too fat and you're not powerful enough. And I can see this personal, and when you look at some of the reporting over the past 7 years, Kim doesn't have that much respect for his older generals and the older people in his government. When he talked about mentally deranged dotard, this older person, when he's talking about the president, he said that about his generals. The way he made these army, 4-star army generals or Navy admirals strip down to their bathing trunks to swim a race for him while he watched the 32-year-old, 33-year-old. This is in 2014. It's a sign that he thinks that he knows better. That because he's young, he's more modern. That he knows that what he sees is the better way. So I can see this relationship that's reportedly warm now turn and get sour ultimately.
Can I say something very quickly about that question? What is his long-term policy? The touchstone of the U.S. ROK relationship for decades, perhaps forever, especially since we're no longer the major trading partner for ROK, although we have important trade still, has been the security alliance. There's absolutely no evidence that President Trump has any regard for the security alliance whatsoever. After the Singapore summit, very short on results or commitments by Kim Jong-un, he called off U.S. military or joint military exercises on the Korean Peninsula, which is generally considered tactically not a very smart thing to do. If you're a military person, it degrades readiness. When he's talked about our alliance, he's talked about it, for instance, during the campaign with irritation that we're spending so much money, and for what? Why don't the Koreans take care of themselves? He has a policy, maybe, but as far as we can tell, is to get rid of Korea as a problem that the U.S. has to worry about. Just go away, take care of yourselves. And as far as trade is concerned, we just have to make sure we have good arrangements so that we make more money than the Koreans do out of it. That's his policy for Korea.
One thing I would add, just an element of history. If you look at the way that the U.S. and North Korea conducted their negotiations in the 1990s, there was an element where Congress played a big role. The deal back then was that in return for North Korea giving up their nuclear weapons program, they would receive 2 light water reactors that are less proliferation prone, and the argument goes that it was more for energy production. And in that period of construction, North Koreans would receive heavy fuel oil that was paid for by the United States. So Congress had big levers in terms of why they wanted to slow it down or ultimately end it. Right now, if you view it from the angle as an analyst and look at the various game plans, The game plan right now is such that the US piece of this is at the various high levels. A lot of the different parts of the risk-taking and the actual provision of the elements of any type of deal with North Korea comes from the South Korean side. And so even if there is a change through the midterm elections where the control of Congress goes to the Democrats, there aren't anything by way of holding up payments in the shipping of heavy fuel oil. It really resides in the executive branch, and this is about the declaration to end the Korean War, to declare the end of the Korean War. Also, that wasn't described as a peace treaty because that would put the ball in Congress's court. You would need the type of majority that wouldn't be possible in getting a peace treaty. And also there are other complications of who the signatories of the peace treaty would be. So one way to view it right now, you're looking at the game plans stripped down to the very bare minimum. And with that, the idea of just pushing this political process further. So from that the analysis of that specific game plan, the potential brakes that Congress could put on this process, that has been more or less muted. Whether that was intentional or not is debatable, but we're in this situation right now.
Professor, please.
I'm Mike Robinson, retired IU professor. I've been teaching about Korea for 35 years and involved even before, and watching President Moon, in a sense, go out there alone to take the leadership has been a very kind of satisfying thing to see after years of Korea being ignored, or as somebody pointed out, pushed around, buffeted by all of the rings. What is his domestic base now, after he's been doing this now a year? Is he getting support domestically, or has he gone too far? As we know about Korean politics, it isn't going to be some kind of political procedure that will censor him. It will be people in the streets. And so I was wondering, Professor Choo, perhaps you could talk about the domestic political situation that is either supporting or inhibiting Chung In-moon.
Okay, thank you. His political base in Korea is pretty solid. If you look at Korean party structure and the party system, there's a good, solid, fundamental basis for each party. Conservatives would have a solid and unswayed vote of 20 to 30% from the populace, and so does the progressive. And there would be about 60% of those undecided populists. They could swing the pendulum either way. And right now, because of all these peace initiatives and the tension de-escalating, and seems like everybody else is also, supporting Moon's initiative towards North Korea. So I think he's garnering a lot of support from Korean populists right now. So his approval rate has been going between 60% to as high as high 80s. So he hasn't gone down below 60% so far. But it's a little bit misleading here because none of the presidents in his first year has gotten below 60% approval rating. And Park Geun-hye in her first year, she enjoyed a 75% approval rating too. Yeah, but the worst president, a president that fared the worst was Roh Moo-hyun when his approval rate went down below 10%, 6%, and so forth. But so far, it has been so good for President Moon. That's true. But following on Director Park's point, while we think the situation has changed in North Korea because of Kim Jong-un's coming out to the world, I think that's quite misleading too, because we think Kim Jong-un has changed over a year or so. But he hasn't changed. If you look at his tactics and strategies, he's exactly following his father's his father also said he's following the last word of his forefather, Kim Il-sung, not to nuclearize the country. And Kim Jong-un is saying the same thing. And when they were approached, both Kims were approached by the United States, it compelled them to amend its relationship with North Korea. Kim Jong-un did it in 1999, and Kim Jong-il did it in 1999, and Kim Jong-un is doing it this year. And then second thing is, there's another parallel here. After Kim Jong-il amended its relationship with China and receiving American leaders and getting in contact with Japan and South Korea between 1999 to 2000, Kim Jong-un is following the exact same step. First going to China, and then talking to the United States, and the order was somewhat changed, in between. South Korea stepped in. And the third parallel here is right after all these, diplomatic endeavors by the Kims, they would show it to the world that they're ready to do something about its economy. And they adopt a series of economic reform measures. The very salient case back in 2002 was July 1st economic reform measure by Kim Jong-il. And right now, after all these series of diplomatic summits and high-level meetings by Kim Jong-un, he's also, now everything's done on the diplomatic front. Now he's turning towards the economic front. So there's a lot of parallel. And the result is, if we borrow the case from Kim Jong-il, then obviously it's a resumption of its nuclear development program. And probably we might see the similar end result after all these endeavors by Kim Jong-un.
There's one parallel I don't expect to be followed. One of the real problems with the negotiation is the North Koreans early on didn't appreciate is how radically U.S. policy can change when the president changes. And essentially, the agreed framework, it had various problems at the end of the Clinton administration, but the engagement with North Korea was moving pretty rapidly in a positive direction in 1999. And so Madeleine Albright had gone to Pyongyang. President, high-ranking North Korean official had visited the White House. Clinton was thinking of going, but the administration ran out of time. So that was essentially the end of the agreed framework because the Bush administration came in and said, we're not going to do any of this. But then the Bush administration finally in its second term decided it was going to start a negotiation. And it ran into problems of the same kind. So as you said, there's a certain pattern here. But they ran out of time also. And so it came to naught. Kim Jong-un, this is different. Kim Jong-un gives every evidence in the certain kind of pressure. He's been the driver of a lot of this stuff. And he seems to have a sense of, I have limited time. One of the reasons he may be a young man, but politically he has limited time. One of the ways he has limited time is President Moon can only serve one term. He's got 4 more years. Then Kim Jong-un will be dealing with another South Korean president who may not be as accommodating or as interested in engagement. And Donald Trump has what? He has 3 years, he has 2 years, 6 months, he has 7 more years. Kim must have some sense that I better, if I'm going to change the equation here, for the benefit of my country, of course, I better move quickly. So I'd be surprised if the North Koreans don't have their eye on the calendar this time, both the US political calendar and the South Korean political calendar. And if they're not determined to do something that will make a big difference for their situation, positive change for their situation, in the world, you know, within the political constraints posed by the U.S. and South Korean political calendars. I'd be surprised if they made that mistake again. Yeah.
So what's the best case then, from Kim's perspective, that sanctions unravel and there are empty or purely declarative limits on their nuclear program? Or is it something else?
Best case, you have the sanctions guy, expert, the world's North Korea sanctions expert right here.
I don't know if that's a thing to brag about, but
This is
sanctions is a big part of it. Yeah. I think on the sanctions piece, you know, the consistent talking point from President Trump and the Trump administration is maximum pressure is still on, and there will be no lifting of sanctions unless North Korea moves on denuclearization. But the reality is, China is the big marketplace for elite North Korean state trading companies. And it's not a function of China lifting sanctions. They abide, as they state, by the letter of UN Security Council resolution sanctions. But if they are easing up on the implementation of those sanctions, then the North Koreans have tremendous coping mechanism opportunities. And at the end of the day, and we touched on this in the earlier exchanges here, you know, North Korea is not a country. It's a 1% elite and then 99%. And within the 99%, there is some improvement with bottom-up marketization, black markets that have become a little more accepted. But when we really look at the sanctions piece, it's about the 1%. And the reality is that they're embedded in the Chinese marketplace. And so this idea of maximum pressure in practice, the North Koreans know it. You know, there is the idea that they have sufficient coping mechanisms there. Now that's different from what the main point of the negotiations now are, lifting of sanctions. Why do the North Koreans keep on insisting on that? Longtime North Korea watchers have been saying that Kim has been making these internal moves away from military first and resources to the military and trying to shift them to light consumer industry for economic reform. And in order to do that, this is where the whole idea of a political document declaring the end of the Korean War is critical for that element. Now that's a thesis, you know, that's a hypothesis. We don't know the full aspects of how that's going to play out. But on the sanctions piece, there are different elements. But the bottom line is, in practice, maximum pressure doesn't quite have that high level of impact as it did last year.
And you know, there was some unprecedented, I mean, there was Trump successes last year with getting everybody on board with maximum pressure. But they were helped by the North Koreans, who did really terrible, nasty things last year. And I think one of the things that I thought of, my first thought when Kim Jong-un gave his New Year's address and said that he was going to mass produce nuclear weapons, and I'm really interested in going to the Olympics, was, so I saw that as maximum pressure taking a huge gasp of air before it starts to deflate. Because it gets, you know, that's what North Korea typically intends with engagement. That's to loosen sanctions implementation and to reduce their neighbors' appetite for implementing these sanctions. They can still stay on the books, but it's a matter of, do the local provincial officials know that they should be cracking down on X, Y, and Z people, or entities. So I think, you know, maximum pressure, I don't know if we're going to ever get back to it in the absence of a major North Korean provocative action. And I also agree with Ambassador Minton on North Korea must be watching the clock, and I think that's one of the big reasons why they did all those missile tests, or the ICBM test and that massive nuclear test in 2017, because then he would still have 4.5 years at that point of President Moon's administration and 3 years of President Trump's administration at a minimum. Well, we'll see. But that you would have the maximum time to try to cement your status as a nuclear weapons power. And so, you know, the best case scenario is, I mean, I guess we're not at nuclear war with North Korea, or that we're not in any military conflict with North Korea, but I think North Korea and the region has been busily trying to make sure, building guardrails and insurance policies to make sure that that doesn't happen. Kim is doing his part, Moon is doing his part, So we'll see.
You know, there's also another interpretation of why he did all that testing and then was willing to call it off, or not call it off, but to suspend it. You know, from one perspective, it's, you know, you build up your chips that give you leverage, and then you spend those chips. To my way of looking at it, he developed these programs to give him diplomatic leverage and to get the attention of the United States, South Korea, China, everybody else. And when he had done that, and when he saw that President Trump was elected and President Moon was elected, he saw an opportunity to spend those chips. An interesting thing about the North Korean nuclear program is that it has steadily developed, but at the same time, the North Koreans have been willing to freeze it at certain points, dispose of certain facilities, suspend activity for stop testing at certain points. You know, that kind of behavior, despite the fact that the rhetoric is very hard-nosed and the testing is very real, is also consistent with the position of building up diplomatic leverage and then switching, you know, your style to take advantage of that leverage you've created to get something at the negotiating table. So it's worth asking the question if that's the dynamic we're in now, and Kim is in fact cashing in his chips.
So I think what he's trying to cash in is that he's trying to sell us Windows 97. We're way past Windows 97. On the ballistic missiles, the North Korean the ballistic missile program is so diverse that, you know, that they're suggesting that they're going to dismantle this missile engine test site is not even a drop in the bucket. And so I think it's not just about one or two missiles that are going up in the sky. It's that over the past 6 years, he's developed a road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile. He's been doing night training. They've been doing special operations forces landings off the coast. He's doing these ballistic missile tests at night on the beach, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, on the North. Why is he doing all of that, right? So it's not just about these satellite launches that we used to talk about, and it's not just about the ICBMs, but the range of short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles that can travel anywhere and that could be solid fuel that reduces time for us to identify. So when they, and that's why I'm so suspicious about blowing up some nuclear test site and about this missile engine test site. Windows 97 versus Windows, what do we have now?
Well, I think there's something important here. It definitely is diplomatic leverage to some extent, but there's something else there. And as I say, Korea exists in the middle of everything that's going on in the world and the region, and as I said, alliances have been downgraded, but we're also through with the era of arms control. There's a story in the New York Times just this afternoon that the Trump administration is going to withdraw from the INF treaty because it doesn't trust the Russians. That's a good point. But it also wants to have flexibility to deal with what it considers a developing Chinese threat. Now, if you're Korea sitting in the midst of all this, alliances have been downgraded. This is for the South Koreans. Alliances have been downgraded. You don't really have faith in Trump's allegiance to the South Korean alliance. And you're North Korea, and you live in such an uncertain world where the major powers, are in fact kind of running away from the NPT and, talking about modernizing their existing weaponry and are running away from the arms control treaties they did negotiate over the last decades. You may have solid military reasons for wanting to maintain your military capacity as well. So I tend to see developments in the Korean Peninsula not entirely in terms of the North Koreans not living up to the letter of undertakings that they have made verbally, at least, which is all true. They haven't lived up to a lot of their undertakings. But if you want to see what's encouraging or stimulating this kind of behavior, you also have to look what other countries are doing, including the major powers around them. And it becomes a very complex picture. We are currently sliding into a very poor position to lecture the North Koreans about reducing weaponry. Well, I mean, if we're going to withdraw from the INF treaty, that's, you know.
I think it also doesn't help that America, I mean, the whole America first
Yes.
and these types of tendencies, not to mention the fact that when we were talking about the bloody nose strike and all that talk about a potential military conflict in or military attack on North Korea, that Senator Graham said very bluntly multiple times, it's better that they die over there. That if people die over there. And so we're not gonna stand by while there's an ICBM threat to CONUS, but that if we're going to, people didn't know when that World War I goes, Hitler was rising, or World War I was going to happen, or World War II was going to happen, but that this is our moment to attack at the root. And so that kind of language doesn't help. That kind of attitude doesn't help. And I think it goes back to your first point, Ambassador Minton, about the government processes. This is what the government processes do, is that they consider, whether to get out of the INF treaty, and what are the implications for, what are the equities that need to be protected elsewhere.
Right.
And that's what these bureaucratic, these National Security Council meetings and other working level meetings do, is that, if they're going to be talking about getting out of the INF treaty, you're going to bet your ass you're going to be tasked with how is China, how are our allies going to be thinking about our withdrawal from the INF treaty. And that's how you get the whole of government effort on these very serious national security threats. But when you're going by piecemeal and kind of freelancing because you just don't like something, then you might be, it's a counterproductive way of conducting foreign policy.
And if
So
you have a
this
national
is
security-
fundamentally,
Go
just
ahead.
to add in, this is fundamentally a management issue. And we're not seeing the continuation of domestic as well as international management systems. In a broader sense, that creates opportunities for other countries. So there's a saying, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And I think what we saw last year were a number of these crises, and different countries are interpreting different ways and moving forward with their respective game plans to maximize their national interests. What that means for the international system is that countries are going in very fundamentally different directions. That leads to this broader question of how are all of these things being coordinated? It's not a function of somehow we revert back to the previous normal and we get back to the system. So the unraveling that's happening, there were factors already in place, but I think thematically keep in mind that these countries are going in different directions and doing things where you can't necessarily dial it back. In the midst of this discussion about the ICBMs and the primary focus from a Trump White House to address the ICBM threat, and from the self-subjective evaluation, that threat has been eliminated and it's taken off the table. That puts Japan's security in jeopardy because there's been no discussion about medium-range missiles. And from a Japanese perspective, there's been robust military cooperation with the US military, particularly in naval capabilities. We saw some of that starting last year, and it's increasing. But that's a function of the US, I think, looking at the different Japanese naval assets as a way to bolster some of the capabilities in the region as well. But this idea of don't let a good crisis go to waste, if you use that as a lens to look at how these countries are going in these different directions, what I mentioned earlier about these unintended, intended consequences, the whole idea of how you put them back into a process through whole of government, through coordination with friends and allies, with international regimes, systems, and so forth. How do you deal with that in a situation where that's already unraveled?
I was going to say, and how do you deal with it in the circumstance when you have a national security advisor who is a longtime proponent of the view that arms control is only possible when not necessary, which is the Bolton view. Please, and identify yourself for all of us and stand up if you don't mind.
Okay. My name is Tim Gitson. I'm a Korea Foundation postdoctoral fellow in the Institute for Korean Studies. I hope I can ask a question that kind of shifts the conversation a bit, and it goes back to Dr. Park, what you were talking about in terms of the hypothesis, right? It's just a hypothesis of Kim Jong-un moving away from allocating resources strictly to military first and moving it to other places, right? The question that I have is about inter-Korea railroad systems, the removal of landmines, and even the reunification of families in North Korea with families in South Korea. How do you contextualize, or how do you place these very particular and very concrete, not progress, but these events, these moments, right? How do we interpret those within this larger conversation?
Sure, thank you. I think that's really about the game plan of the two Koreas with the Panmunjom Declaration. It's laid out, and it was very clear that they would do these projects. In many instances, these are the same principles and same projects that have been mentioned in previous inter-Korean discussions, but never got to fruition. In this environment, the South Koreans are as much the focus of sanctions as anyone else. There are a number of restrictions. But I think one way to look at how the South Koreans are approaching this, is this idea of it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And so with that, we're seeing a lot of movement. What the railroad projects really talk about is this vision of connecting the South Korean economy, which functions like an island economy, as a way to stabilize the situation and provide some opportunities, prosperity in the future. So there is, again, a sense of this opportunity in trying to maximize as much as possible. But the way to change the dynamic between the two Koreas, there are a couple of major differences in terms of how the Moon government is trying to approach this. One is this idea that when you look at the overall situation to improve the political situation, then the nuclear issues, security issues are addressed later on as well. That's a hypothesis that's being tested in real time. The second is this element of not giving aid to the North Koreans or paying them off or bribing them to act a certain way, but truly converting the Kim regime into a partner. And if you look at it, it's almost like a business partner. So with this, as you can see, denuclearization becomes secondary. And so this is, if you take the step back, already the idea of prioritization of denuclearization, for the main actors in the region, this is not the priority. The other final thing I'd mention is when you look at how this is all playing out, there are the building blocks aspect. But fundamentally, if you think of it as the two Koreas being business partners, they're addressing it in terms of business risks. What could derail this ongoing process? One is the lingering negative image of the North Korean regime. And so there's a big effort to try to socialize this. Amazingly, whenever there is a world leader who meets with Kim Jong-un, the sentiment that comes back is that he's a polite young man. And so I think this idea of the branding aspect and the whole notion of changing the dynamics, as much as we look at it with concern about lack of progress on the denuclearization side, those are factual, those are realities on the ground. The way things are moving on over there, I think, is much more advanced and many steps ahead than we put into our analysis over here.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes, please. Dr. Choi.
I'm Ria Che from the Institute for Korean Studies, a postdoctoral fellow. I wonder how much leverage the two Koreas and China have against each other. I saw the slide that Dr. Choo presented when he started talking, and I saw something there about China having no leverage over North Korea. So yeah, how do they, what kind of power relationship is going on?
Okay, yeah, because I was asked to prepare for a 3-minute talk, starting a remark and prepare a slide. Yeah, there I just briefly mentioned about China losing grip on North Korea and its diminishing influence on North Korea, and I try to look at it from 3 different perspectives. 1 is economic, 2 is diplomatic, and 3 is military. Because when you say a state has an influence over the other, you mean you put pressure and you are able to derive expected outcomes to your interest. And obviously you're having influence over the behavior of the other. And here, usually, these three means, economic means and diplomatic or political means and military means are usually the case, especially if you have an alliance relationship. And economically speaking, I think China started to lose grip on North Korea with this decision to open up the country and adopt economic reform measures in 1978. And as I pointed out in the slide, I think the driving wedge was 1994 when China asked North Korea to pay its trade in hard currency. And I think that really offended North Korea. And politically and diplomatically speaking, North Korea really depended on China for its contact with the outside world throughout the entire Cold War period, as well as the early part of the post-Cold War period. But I think this is where it gets interesting. In 1991, there was, South Korea and North Korea simultaneously joined the United Nations, and I think that totally changed the diplomatic picture of North Korea. Since it joined the United Nations, it doesn't have to rely on China to get to the outside world. So I think if anybody is interested in the history of Korea, I think that simultaneous joint membership to the United Nations, I think that deserves a review. And militarily and speaking, we all know China and North Korea does not have an orthodox or conventional alliance relationship. Since they come into alliance in 1961, there has not been a Chinese military stationing in North Korea and vice versa. And there has not been a joint military exercise held together, never ever. Third, the last time there was a military transaction between the two countries was in 1993 or 1992, and that was because North Korea was in need of, parts to really fix its imported weapons from China, and that was the last transaction, official transaction, and there was no military weapons or supplies coming free of cost from China in the 80s at all. So by looking at from these three different perspectives, I could confidently say that China does not have as much influence as we might we would like to believe, despite its close diplomatic relationship as we are seeing today.
It's okay.
Please go.
With regard to China and actually all outside powers, North Koreans have a strategic decision to make, and it'll be very interesting to see evidence of which way Kim Jong-un is going. On the one hand, the greatest threat to the regime potentially is South Korea because it's Korean and it shows up, the economy and the social structure of North Korea as very unfavorably in comparison with South Korea. But on the other hand, working a modus vivendi out with South Korea is the best insurance that North Korea could buy to prevent falling under the domination of another power, a non-Korean power, a neighbor, a powerful neighbor. Who could that be? I don't think they're really afraid of Japan. They probably understand if they don't want to slip, as they were beginning to, completely into a sort of feudal relationship with a much more powerful China, the only way to leverage, Korean power in this neighborhood is to work something out with South Korea. So there's a gamble either way you go, and they have to make the North Koreans have to make a strategic decision whether they're going to take a risk to really make a breakthrough with South Korea and make some kind of arrangement that will preserve the regime but will allow them to have a decent economic relationship and a beneficial one with South Korea and therefore with the rest of the outside world, or whether they are going to be isolated and therefore probably dependent upon China and under what they would consider excessive Chinese influence. There's little question in my mind which one they would prefer. They wouldn't prefer being under China's thumb. But the question is a calculation of risk if they go the other way. I don't know that there's evidence yet to indicate what their strategic decision has been made, but at least it's been mooted by the recent diplomacy. And it's on the table.
All right, I'm going to let Dr. Park and then Dr. Pak get the last word, and we'll start.
Let's see. I'd say that what keeps me up at night is not the nuclear weapons coming over and hitting Washington. What keeps me up at night is something small scale. Crab season, and their North Korean boats or South Korean boats leads to artillery fire, one of the islands blows up. Or a chemical weapons attack that's completely deniable. Or something, something at the subconventional level that could spark something unintentionally as a result. So that's, but I guess another thing that keeps me up at night is, what is all this for? Why do you need all those missiles? Why do you need a road mobile missile? Why do you have 200,000 special operations forces that are able to land in South Korea or Japan? Why do you need the world's third largest stockpile of chemical and biological weapons? Why do you need to why are you mass producing fissile material? What are you going to do with all of that? And so, what is all this about? What is the so what in this? Now, I think that the North Korean mantra has been the dream deferred has been reunification on its terms. I think in Kim Jong-il's era, in Kim Il-sung's era, I think it was plausible because South Korea was still rebuilding. Kim Il-sung had massive aid from the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and it was still plausible, which is why I think they undertook all of those these terrorist activities there. And there was a strong left movement in South Korea. During Kim Jong-il's era, I think Kim probably thought that it was not possible. 70 or 80% of its people are malnourished. Its soldiers, the conscript minimum height requirement is 4'9" or 4'8". Their armaments are aging. They're old 50s, 60s Soviet armaments. And they had the famine in which up to 2 million people died, and they're still feeling the effects of it, and in the weight of the people now. And the Soviet Union was gone. So I don't think that Kim Jong-il at that point in the 90s had these grand visions of unification. I worry about Kim Jong-un because he never had to experience all of that or any of that. During the famine, he was in Switzerland, swimming in the Riviera and skiing in the Alps. And not that he would have known about the famine anyway, because he would be very sheltered in one of the family's 70 or so villas. And he never knew the Soviet Union, he never knew the Chinese, he has no ontological relationship to those countries. But in effect, he was somebody who grew up in a cocoon of privilege and indulgence, who was catered to by small armies of people who told him he was the best thing ever, and that his confidence has grown as a result. So I worry about how much that confidence grows and how much he thinks that his nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles can accomplish.
A lot of things to worry about, but I think with the current situation, I would end on two notes. One is that we have not seen this level of political risk being taken simultaneously. So it could all just time run out, and this will be viewed as a historic moment and opportunity lost, and then the dire consequences of that. If North Korea goes back to the testing cycle, we see miscalculation and escalation that's uncontrolled. The other element, though, is It sounds very benign, but the sense that the international system isn't working as it did before. You're seeing a lot of developments happening simultaneously without coordination. That should alarm everyone, because the thing that we talk about here is also, to put it into context, is happening in the middle of a US-China trade war. You're looking at this type of situation where the global economy is in such a situation where how this all plays out is going to be another set of forces that could adversely or positively affect what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. So I would conclude on this note of uncertainty. We're really in this situation of uncharted territory. There are patterns, there's symmetry, there's a sense of we've been here before, there will be a repetition of it, but there are new elements here. And the fundamental new element is the United States not playing a global leadership role. And that element, for the tactical side of things, don't let a good crisis go to waste. There could be marginal improvements that go only to a certain level. It might go all the way, we don't know. But this is a part of it where this is the time to be much more strategic and interdisciplinary, because these events are not happening in this isolated type of situation. It's not just the Korean Peninsula. And so going forward, how all of these things are interconnected, and then what the implications of all of these things are, really important. The big distraction, though, is the Twitter feed is so entertaining. The real world is happening in such a way that forget about reality TV anymore. You just have to go to your Twitter feed. But I think that part of it has to be another element, another factor that we have to put into a broader framework. But the lack of frameworks and the lack of this type of strategic analysis that's going on, I'm worried that we're missing a lot of these different patterns. And in hindsight, we'll be very clear, but right now, clearly aren't.
Good point.
I think that's a good note on which to end. What was a sort of iron rule of diplomacy? Only one global crisis at a time.
Oh, yes.
And we're in a circumstance in which, if there's a strategy, it seems to have as many at a time as possible. But also in a context in which structurally there's been a recession of U.S. global leadership, and that's just been magnified by the proclivities of this particular administration. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific discussion.
Good job. Good job.